In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And Thud, who picked up a chimera, not all of it, even Thud had limits, just the forward end, fingers dug into a joint that shouldn't have had gap for fingers, a meter off the ground for 9 seconds, while a man was dragged out from under the drive assembly. Then he set it down, cracked the road, and looked at the crack like a man who'd broken something in someone else's house and hoped nobody had noticed. Hey, I'm your brother from the void, and this is Tales from the Void. Today's story comes from Corporal Gevrin Praith, Presscan 61st, conscripted off a reclamation line where he took broken things apart without wrecking the pieces. When the section was assigned an Ogryn and somebody had to manage it, the sergeant nominated the man who could strip an engine without swearing at it. Settle in. This is Tales from the Void. Let's begin. Thud picked up the chimera. I need to qualify that. He did not pick up the entire chimera. Even Thud had his limits, and a chimera weighs somewhere north of 38 tons, fully loaded. What he did was grab the forward hull where the glacis plate meets the track guard, dig his fingers into a joint that should not have had enough gap for fingers, and lift that end about a meter off the ground while I crawled underneath to pull Luskin free from what was left of the drive assembly. The whole thing took about 9 seconds. Luskin was screaming the entire time. Thud was not making any sound at all, which I had learned was how you could tell he was concentrating. When he put the chimera down, it dropped the last hand's width, and the impact cracked the road surface in a line that ran about 4 meters in each direction, and Thud looked at the crack for a moment with the expression of a man who had broken something in somebody else's house and was hoping nobody had noticed. I told him it was fine. He told me the road was angry. I did not have time to address that because Luskin's left leg was facing a direction that legs are not supposed to face, and the rest of 2nd Platoon was still 300 meters behind us in a firefight that I could hear but could not usefully contribute to. That was day 11 on Vressengard in the industrial flats south of Hive Ketran, and it was the last time anything on that campaign resembled normal soldiering. My name is Gevrin Praith, Corporal, Preskin 61st Line Infantry. I was 26 years old when they shipped us to Vressengard, which means I was 22 when I was conscripted off a reclamation line on Prescan, where my job had been dismantling things that other people had decided were no longer worth maintaining. Engines, mostly. Structural assemblies. Whatever the Munitorum declared surplus in the morning was in pieces by evening. I had a knack for taking things apart without destroying any of the components, which meant the components could be used again, which meant somebody further up the chain could file a recovery report instead of a loss report, which meant my foreman liked me. It also meant I was patient, and I did not talk much, and I could keep track of 40 or 50 individual parts without losing any of them. And when Sergeant Dukin Lanhi was told he was getting an Ogryn attached to his section and needed to nominate somebody to manage the thing, he nominated the man who could disassemble an engine without swearing at it. The man in question was not consulted. I have heard a great many people talk about Ogryns, and very few of them have ever spent time with one. An Ogryn is not a weapon that walks. An Ogryn is not a blunt instrument. An Ogryn is not, as the regimental briefing file described it, a category tertius ab humon combat auxiliary requiring supervision in non-combat environments. An Ogryn is a person, a very large person with a skull like a gun emplacement and hands that could close around your ribcage and meet in the middle. But a person with preferences and moods and things he was afraid of, and things that made him happy, and a way of looking at the world that was not the same as yours, and was not worse than yours, and, as it turned out, was in several important respects considerably better. But I am getting ahead of myself. Thud arrived with a supply convoy about 9 months before we deployed to Vressengard. He arrived alone, which I have since learned is not how it is supposed to work. Ogryns are raised and fought in squads under one of their own, a big one with a bit more in his head than the rest, and a regiment rated for abhuman auxiliaries gets 6 or 8 of them together with a handler section to match. The Preskin 61st was not rated for anything. We were a line regiment on a standard establishment, and what we received was one Ogryn, unaccompanied, against a requisition nobody in the regiment could remember submitting, with a transfer docket that listed his previous unit as disbanded and gave no further detail. Somewhere there had been a squad and a big one to lead it, and something had happened to them, and what was left over had been packaged and forwarded to the next formation with a space in its returns, because the Munitorum does not hold surplus, and an Ogryn is surplus until he is issued. He came off the back of a Cargo 8 transport in a crouch, because the Cargo 8's ceiling clearance is about 2 meters, and Thud was 2.70 meters standing straight, and the first thing he did on solid ground was stand up fully, roll his shoulders until something in his back produced a sound like a loss pack cooking off, and then look around very slowly at everything within about 100 meters as though he were cataloging it. He had a ripper gun across his back that weighed more than I did. He was wearing a set of custom-fitted flak plate that looked like it had been made from 3 standard sets bolted together. He had a tin cup hanging from his belt on a piece of wire, battered and dented and clearly older than any of his other equipment, and he held it against his thigh with one hand the entire time he was walking toward us, as though he were afraid it might fall. Everything else on him had been issued by somebody. The plate out of 3 sets, the gun, the wire the cup hung from. The cup had not. It was the one object he owned that no requisition accounted for, and it had come out of a unit the paperwork called disbanded and did not describe further. I never asked where it was from. That was not delicacy. It simply never occurred to me that a thing like Thud had a before. Sergeant Land looked at him, looked at me, said, "He is yours, Pratha. Try not to break him," and walked away before I could formulate a response. Thud looked down at me. I am not a small man. On Prescan, I had been considered slightly above average height. Thud made me feel like a child standing next to factory scaffolding. He studied my face for what felt like a long time, and then he said very carefully, as though the word were something he had rehearsed, "Hello." I said hello back. He smiled. It was the most disarming thing I had ever seen on a face that size. Then he reached down and picked up my pack, 40 kilos with ammunition, which I had set on the ground, and put it on his shoulder alongside his ripper gun as though it were a coin purse, and started walking toward the barracks. I had not told him where the barracks were. I had not introduced myself. I had not given him any instruction at all. He had simply decided, on the basis of evidence I could not identify, that I was his person, and that the correct thing to do was carry my things. I jogged after him and told him my name was Ogryn. He tried it twice, got stuck on the second syllable both times, and settled on Gev. For the next 11 months, that was what he called me. No rank, no surname, just Gev, said with the absolute confidence of a man who has solved a problem to his complete satisfaction. The Preskin 61st was a line regiment, standard issue, 11,000 men when we shipped, and probably about 10,500 by the time we made planetfall, because the crossing took 4 weeks, and some of us did not survive it. We were not told why. We were not told much about anything, which was not unusual. The briefing said Vressengard. The briefing said compliance action. The briefing said armed insurrection against lawful imperial authority, which could mean anything from an organized military rebellion to a food riot that somebody with enough rank had decided should be answered with a regiment instead of a provost detachment. We got our operational orders on the ground 2 days after landing at a forward staging base about 50 kilometers south of Hive Ketren, and the operational orders said the same thing the briefing had said in slightly longer sentences. We were to assist in the restoration of imperial authority within the Ketren administrative zone. Rules of engagement were standard. Weapons free on confirmed hostiles. Collateral guidance was listed as acceptable within operational parameters. Nobody asked what operational parameters meant. Nobody ever did. Hive Ketren was a city of over 90 million people, which is modest by Hive standards, built on what had once been productive land, and was now whatever you call the ground underneath 1,100 years of habitation. The lower levels were industrial, the mid-levels were residential, the upper spires were administratum and governance, and the underhive was what the underhive always is, which is the place where everything the upper levels do not want to see ends up living. The insurrection, we were told, had started in the mid-levels and spread downward. Armed gangs, organized resistance, supply disruption. The usual vocabulary that gets applied to people who have decided they would rather fight than do what they are told. We were the 4th regiment committed to the campaign. The first 3 had been operating inside the hive for about 7 months before we arrived, and the situation had not improved, which in military language means it had gotten considerably worse, but nobody wanted to say so in a document that would be read by somebody with a higher rank than the person who wrote it. Operating with Thud is the thing I think about when I am not thinking about anything else. An Ogryn in a combat zone is a force of nature in approximately the way that a landslide is a force of nature. He does not take cover. He does not suppress. He does not do any of the things that a competent infantryman is trained to do, because none of those things apply to a person who can absorb a burst of autogun fire, the way a normal man absorbs a strong breeze. What an Ogryn does is advance. He walks forward and the enemy has a problem, because everything that works against a normal target does not work against this target. And by the time they have adjusted to that reality, the target is standing among them, and things are happening very quickly, and none of the things are good. Thud's Ripper gun was a drum-fed automatic weapon, about 1.5 meters long with a saw-toothed bayonet underneath the barrel that was nearly as long as my arm, and the drums came up from stores in crates that took 2 men to carry, and that Thud carried one under each arm. In close quarters, he used it as a club as often as he fired it, and the difference in outcome between the 2 approaches was largely academic. That was Thud in a fight. Out of 1, he was the quietest person I had ever met. He sat where I told him to sit and stayed there. He ate whatever he was given, which was a lot, because an Ogryn burns through rations the way a Lehman Russ burns through fuel, and the quartermasters had learned early that an underfed one is a problem nobody wants to manage. He slept on his back with his Ripper gun across his chest and his tin cup in his left hand, and he snored in a register that made the walls vibrate. He was afraid of the dark, which I discovered on the second night when the power went out in the barracks, and he grabbed my arm hard enough to leave bruises that lasted a week. He was not afraid of being shot at, or of explosions, or of enemy combatants screaming and charging his position. He was afraid of the dark. I never worked out why, and after the first few weeks I stopped trying, since it did not matter. When the lights went off, I sat next to him and talked about nothing until they came back on, and that was the arrangement, and neither of us questioned it. The thing that nobody told me, and that I had to learn for myself, was that Thud could smell what people were feeling. There was nothing of the witch about it. He had a face built around his nose. The whole middle of it was nasal cavity, 3 or 4 times the volume of mine, with a wet flattened pad at the end that moved on its own when he was working something out. A frightened man sweats differently from a man who has been running. Different glands, different output. It was not a gift. It was anatomy, and a tracker hound does the same thing, and nobody calls a hound blessed. What it meant in practice was that he knew when someone near him was frightened before they knew it themselves. He would turn and look at a man who had not said anything, had not changed posture, had not done anything observable at all, and he would say that one is scared, or that one is angry, or that one is hurt, and he would be right every single time. I tested it. Not deliberately at first. At first, I just noticed it and thought it was coincidence. But after the first month, I started paying attention, and after the second month, I stopped doubting it. Thud could not read a word. He could not count reliably past about 12. He could not explain how a las gun worked, or what a commissar was for, or why we were on Vressengard. But he could walk into a room and tell you within 30 seconds which person in that room was about to do something wrong, because the man who is about to do something wrong is frightened of doing it, and his glands do not know how to lie. I asked him once how he knew. He thought about it for a long time. Then he said, "They smell different." He said it the way you would explain that water is wet, with a slight pause first while he worked out why anyone would need telling. The ability was real, and it saved lives, including mine, more than once in the early weeks. It also meant something else, which did not become clear to me until much later. A man can decide not to look at a thing. There is no equivalent for a nose. Everything a frightened person put into the air around him arrived continuously from every direction, with no way to close it off and no vocabulary to describe it, and no idea that the rest of us were not doing the same. Whatever was happening inside him later, he was not choosing to attend to it. It was simply arriving the way weather arrives. The first 3 weeks were almost tolerable. We operated in the industrial flats around the hive's southern perimeter, clearing district by district, building by building. The rebels down there were armed, organized, and genuinely hostile. They had autoguns, a few heavy stubbers, and in one memorable instance, a mining laser that had been ripped from a drill rig and mounted on a ground car, which worked exactly once before the power cell cooked off and solved the problem for us. We lost men, 11 in the first week, 19 in the second, 7 in the third. Sergeant Lanny took a piece of shrapnel in the shoulder on day 4, and did not mention it until the wound had gone septic enough that the medici threatened to sedate him if he did not sit still. Lieutenant Canher ran 2nd Platoon from a command post 3 streets behind the line and made decisions that were, by the modest standards of the Preskin 61st, competent. Commissar Strom walked the line every day and said very little. He was a thin man, Strom, with a face that looked like it had been designed for a larger skull and then compressed slightly during assembly. He wore his bolt pistol in a cross-draw holster on his left hip, and he had a habit of resting his hand on the grip the way some men rest their hand on a railing. Not threateningly. It was just where his hand went when it was doing nothing else, the way mine went to my canteen and Thud's to his tin cup. Thud was extraordinary in those early weeks. I do not mean that he was more violent or more effective than expected, although he was both of those things. I mean that he was precise. An Ogryn is supposed to be a blunt mass of muscle pointed in a direction and released, and if some of it spills over onto things you did not intend to destroy, that is the cost of the tool. Thud knew where his body was in space at all times, the way a man who has lived his entire life in a small room knows where every piece of furniture sits. He could move through a doorway that was technically too narrow for him by turning his shoulders at exactly the right moment. He could fire his Ripper gun in a hallway and not hit any of the men standing behind him, which is something I have seen trained guardsmen fail to do with weapons a quarter the size. He could step over a wounded man without looking down and never come close to touching him. I once watched him pick up a dropped grenade, live, pin already out. Some idiot in third section had fumbled it, and throw it through a window across the street and 20 meters above ground level with the casual accuracy of a man tossing a bottle into a bin. And then he looked at the idiot from third section with an expression of such profound disappointment that the man apologized to an Ogryn in front of his entire squad, and nobody laughed. He had a name for everything. Not the correct name. His own name. The Ripper gun was loud. The tin cup was old. The barracks was home, even when we were sleeping in a shelled-out warehouse 40 kilometers from the actual barracks. Ration packs were flat, after the shape of the packaging. Sergeant Lan He was boss, which was close enough. Commissar Strom was hat, which was not close at all, but was at least descriptive. The enemy, whoever they were on any given day, were angry ones. And the civilians we encountered in the cleared districts were small ones regardless of their actual size. I should have paid more attention to that last one than I did. We started encountering civilians in the second week when we pushed into the first residential sector south of the Hab line. The industrial flats had been largely depopulated. The workers had either fled deeper into the hive or joined the insurrection or been killed in the initial fighting before we arrived. But the residential sectors were different. People lived there, families. They had nowhere to go. The upper levels sealed by order of the planetary governor, the lower levels a war zone. So they sat in their habs and hoped it would pass over them the way storms pass over buildings. Clearing floor by floor, what we found was mostly frightened people trying very hard to be invisible, women holding children against walls, old men sitting in chairs staring at doorways, groups of young people with their hands up and their eyes on the floor. We searched them. We searched their homes. We moved on. That was the procedure. Clear, search, secure, advance. Nobody was supposed to be harmed unless they presented a threat, and the definition of threat was, at that point, still narrow enough to mean something. Thud did not like it. I noticed it on the first residential clearance, when we entered a hab block on the 5th floor of a structure that the briefing called Sector 14, and the locals probably called something else. There were about 40 people in the common area, sitting on the floor where someone had told them to sit, and they had done it. They were quiet, not calm. Quiet the way people are quiet when they are so frightened that the machinery responsible for producing sound has temporarily shut down. Thud came through the door behind me, and every person in that room looked at him, and the quality of the silence changed from the kind that means nobody is talking to the kind that means nobody is breathing. An Ogryn in a doorway is the sort of thing that does not require context. You do not need to know what it is. You know that you do not want it to be there. Thud stopped. He looked at the room. He looked at the people. Then he put his Ripper gun on the ground, very carefully, the way you put down a sleeping child, and he stood with his hands at his sides, and he said, very quietly, not angry. Small ones, not angry. He had read the room in the time it took to step through the door and put down the most frightening thing he was carrying, and said the only thing his vocabulary allowed. Not angry. He stood there with his hands open and his palms turned outward, and one of the children, a girl who could not have been more than 4 or 5, stopped crying. She did not stop because she stopped being afraid. She stopped because she was looking at something she had not seen before, which was the largest human being she would ever encounter in her life, standing in a doorway with his hands open and a look on his face that was unmistakably concern. Thud looked at me. He said, "Gev, small one's scared." I knew. He said, "Why?" "Because of the fighting," I said. He thought about that. Then he said, "We stopped fighting here." "We were not fighting here," I told him. We were searching, and we would be gone soon, and they could go back to whatever they had been doing. He thought about that, too. Then he nodded, picked up his ripper gun, and followed me through the rest of the clearance in silence. But he was different for the rest of the day. Quieter, which for Thud was a significant achievement. He kept looking at doorways after we had passed through them, looking back at the rooms we had already cleared, as though he were checking on something. I asked what he was looking at. "Making sure," he said. "Making sure of what?" "Small ones still there, still okay." We completed the clearance. We moved on. 3 more buildings that day, 2 the next, and in every one the same thing. Thud would come through the door, read the room, put down his weapon if there were civilians present, and stand with his hands open until I told him to move. It added about 30 seconds to every room entry, which Sergeant Lanny noticed and chose not to comment on, and which Commissar Strom also noticed and also chose not to comment on, although his reasons for silence were probably different from the sergeant's, and I did not want to speculate on what they were. Nobody had told him to do it. Nobody had briefed him on it. He had walked into a room full of frightened people and worked out that a very large person owes very small ones something, and he never once let it slip, which is more than any of us managed. The orders changed at the end of the 3rd week. Colonel Grice held a briefing for all company and platoon commanders in a requisitioned Skolam building about 2 kilometers behind the line. I was not at the briefing. Corporals do not attend briefings, but Lieutenant Canher came back from it with a face that looked as though somebody had reached inside it and removed a component. He called the section leaders together, which included Sergeant Lanny and, by extension, me, since I went where the sergeant went and Thud went where I went, and the chain of dependency extended downward from there. The lieutenant stood in the doorway of the room we had been using as a command post and looked at the floor for about 15 seconds before he said anything, and when he did say something, it was in the tone of voice that people use when they are reading aloud from a document that they did not write and do not agree with, but are required to deliver accurately. The operational parameters, he said, had been revised. The campaign was entering its 2nd phase. Phase 1 had been the suppression of armed resistance in the outer districts, which was what we had been doing. Phase 2 was the pacification of the residential sectors, which was what we had been told we would be doing next. But the definition of pacification had been updated. The previous definition, which amounted to clear and search and move on, was being replaced. The new definition included population control measures. The lieutenant said those 3 words, population control measures, as though each one had a sharp edge and he were trying to pass them through his mouth without cutting himself. The residential sectors were to be cleared not of combatants, but of residents. The population was to be relocated to designated holding areas in the lower industrial sectors, where they would be processed and housed until the security situation was resolved. Anyone who refused relocation was to be treated as a hostile. Anyone who obstructed the relocation was to be treated as a hostile. The definition of obstruction included verbal protest. Sergeant Lanhy asked what happens to them after they have been relocated. The lieutenant said he did not know. The briefing had not addressed it, and nobody at the briefing had wanted to be the man who asked. He said that last part in a tone that made clear he knew how it sounded. And then he said that we had our orders and that we would execute them starting at 0600 the following morning, and he left the room before anyone could ask anything else. I sat with Thud that night in the corner of the warehouse where we had been sleeping. Thud was holding his tin cup in both hands, turning it slowly, running his thumb along a dent in the rim that had been there since before I knew him. He was watching me. He had been watching me since the lieutenant left, and I knew he had read something in me that I had not yet identified in myself, because that was what Thud did, and he was never wrong. "Gev worried," he said. I was not worried, I said. He considered this and then told me, with the polite certainty of a man correcting a factual error, "Yes, you are." So I gave him the new orders in the simplest words I had, since he got lost in complicated ones, and the simple words were more honest anyway. "We are going to tell people to leave their homes," I said, "families. And if they do not want to leave, we are going to make them." Thud was quiet for a long time, then he said, "Small ones too," and I said yes, small ones too. He put his cup down on the ground next to his ripper gun and folded his hands in his lap and looked at them. They were enormous hands. Each finger was about the width of my wrist. He had killed men with those hands, twisted metal with them, peeled armor, plating off a vehicle hull with them. He was looking at them the way a man looks at a tool he is no longer certain he knows how to use. Then he said, "Where they go?" And I told him I did not know. He nodded, picked up his cup, held it against his chest, and said nothing else for the rest of the night. The relocations began the next morning, and from the first hour they were exactly as bad as I had expected, and slightly worse than I had allowed myself to imagine. The procedure was straightforward. We entered a HAB block. We announced on a loud hailer that all residents were required to report to the ground floor with 1 bag of personal belongings per person. Maximum weight, 10 kilos. Within 30 minutes. We waited 30 minutes. Then we went floor by floor and carried down anyone who had not come voluntarily, which on the first day was about 1/3 of them, and by the second day about half, once word had spread about what the holding areas looked like. Some of them resisted, some of them fought, some of them screamed or cried or simply went limp and had to be dragged, which is physically exhausting work, even when the person being dragged is cooperating at the level of not actively trying to kill you. The ones who fought were subdued. That is the word Lieutenant Canher used. Subdued. There is no dignifying in military language the subduing of a 60-year-old woman hitting you with a cooking pot because you are removing her from a home she has lived in for 40 years. Military language was what we had. The gap between it and the thing it described grew wider every day. Thud carried people. That was the task I gave him, since I had to give him something, and it was the thing he could do that caused the least harm and the most good within the parameters of an operation that was not designed to contain any good at all. When we reached a floor where people could not or would not walk, the elderly, the sick, the very young, the ones who had simply stopped functioning at a level that included voluntary movement, Thud picked them up and carried them. He cradled old women in his arms as though they were infants and held children against his chest with one hand while using the other to navigate stairwells that were not built for a person his size, and not one of them was hurt by his hands. He spoke to them while he carried them. Not words that made any sense, just sounds. The kind of sounds you make to a frightened animal when you cannot explain that you are not the thing it should be afraid of, except that you are exactly that thing. So the sounds are a lie told in a register that does not require language. Thud made those sounds, and the people he carried heard them, and some of them stopped shaking. And I watched this happen, and I said nothing about it to anyone. The holding areas were in the industrial flats we had already cleared, down in the sectors where the manufacturing plants had been shut down, and the workers had been removed, and the buildings stood empty. They were not holding areas. They were pens. Bare ferrocrete floors, no sanitation beyond chemical latrines spaced one for every 400 people, no heating, no beds. The perimeter was fenced with razor wire and guarded by men from the Alvin Mark 9th, another regiment that had been on Vressengard, longer than us, and had the look of men who had been doing things they did not want to think about for long enough that they had stopped thinking about anything at all. The civilians were marched in through the main gate and counted and told to find a space. That was the extent of the processing. Counted and told to find a space. There should have been a form. The administratum requires a form for the intake of displaced persons. I had filled one out on Presken when a hab block near the reclamation line burned down and 40 families were rehoused. No forms arrived on Vressengard. It is the only time I can recall the administratum failing to supply paperwork. The areas filled quickly. By the end of the first week, there were about 30,000 people in 4 holding areas, artilams, across the southern flats, and the number was growing by 2,000 or 3,000 a day, and nobody had told us what would happen to them when the areas were full. Thud stopped sleeping on the second night of the relocations. I did not notice immediately. Thud was quiet at night anyway, and I was tired enough to sleep through most things. But on the third morning I woke up and he was in the same position he had been in when I fell asleep, sitting against the wall with his cup in his hands and his eyes open. And when I asked him if he had slept, he said no. I asked him why. He said, "Too loud." I listened. There was nothing. No firing, no vehicles, no movement of any kind in the immediate area. I told him it was quiet. He shook his head. He said, "No," pointing in the direction of the holding areas, which were about 3 kilometers south of our position. Too loud. I could not hear anything from 3 kilometers away. Thud could. For a long time, I let myself think of that as something mysterious. The correction is worse. There was nothing mysterious about it. The same face that read a man's sweat across a room was built around ears set for a creature that hunts, and 30,000 people confined in an open-air pen on a still night make a sound. It carries. It is not loud where it lands, but it does not stop, and a man does not have to be extraordinary to hear it. He only has to have been made for hearing things at that distance, and then be unable to stop. That is what I had been calling a mystery. He was hearing them. Every night, 3 kilometers away, he was hearing a pen with 400 people to a latrine, and no roof on it, and he had no way to turn it off, and no word for what it was, and no reason to think the rest of us were not hearing it too. And when he told me it was too loud, I told him it was quiet. He stopped sleeping, and within a few days he stopped eating as much as he usually did, which for Thud was the equivalent of a hunger strike. And Sergeant Lanhi asked me what was wrong with him, and I said I did not know, since the alternative was saying something that would have required both of us to acknowledge a reality that we were not prepared to acknowledge. On the 8th day of the relocations, the orders changed again. This time, the change did not come through Lieutenant Canher. It came through Commissar Strom, and I understood the arrangement even then. Directives come down through officers. Directives an officer might decline to pass on come down through the man whose function is to make declining unthinkable. He appeared at our section's position at 0500 with a data slate and the expression of a man who has been told to deliver a message he did not compose and cannot refuse to transmit. He read us the new operational directive standing in the rain. The holding areas were approaching capacity. The rate of relocation was to be maintained, but the processing protocol had been updated. Any individual found to be of military age, defined as between 16 and 55, who could not demonstrate a documented exemption from militia service, was to be separated from the general population and transferred to a secondary facility for further assessment. The directive used the word assessment 3 times and defined it never, and nobody asked because Strom was standing in front of us with his hand on his bolt pistol, and his bolt pistol was not a railing. Thud was standing behind me. I felt him shift his weight when Strom read the word separated, and then shift again when he read the age range, and then go very still. Thud did not understand data slates or operational directives or the word protocol, but he understood the word separated. It was a simple word, and he did not need the numbers at all, since the directive was going to be applied to people standing in front of him, and he could see which ones. And he understood the tone in which Strom was reading, because Thud read tones the way other people read text. After Strom left, Thud said, "Gev, Hat Man scared." "The commissar was not scared," I said. "Yes, he is. Smells wrong. Smells like before fighting, but no fighting." "Leave it alone," I said. He said, "Gev worried." "That too," I said, and he gave me the look he always gave me when I contradicted his own nose. Patient, faintly puzzled, the way you look at a machine that has produced an output you did not expect but are willing to wait on. We separated people that day, 17 families, 43 individuals of military age, pulled out of the column and directed to a side street where a chimera from the Alvin Mark 9th was waiting. The chimera took them south toward a facility that was not on any map I had been shown, and it came back empty within the hour and waited for the next batch. The families we left behind stood in the column and did not move and did not speak, and some of the children who had been separated from older siblings or parents made sounds that I can still hear now, at this distance, with this much time between me and that street. They were not screaming. Screaming would have been easier. They were making the sound that a human being makes when something has been removed from them that they cannot survive without, and their body has not yet caught up to the fact that it is gone. Thud put every one of those children on his shoulders and carried them to the holding area himself, one at a time, and with each trip his face changed a little more, like a surface being eroded. And by the end of the day, the expression he wore was one I had never seen on him, and hope never to see on any face again. It was not anger. Thud did not really do anger, not as a response to injustice or cruelty. It was something worse. It was confusion that had reached the very bottom of itself and found something solid down there, and the solid thing was understanding. And the understanding was that the people he trusted to tell him what to do were telling him to do wrong things. He did not say any of this. Thud could not have articulated it in words even if he had tried, but I saw it because after 11 months I could read Thud the way Thud could read everyone else. And what I read in him that evening was a man who had arrived at a conclusion that he could not retreat from. That night he spoke to me for the last time about anything that was not operational. We were sitting in the rain under a sheet of corrugated roofing that he had pulled off a damaged building and propped against a wall at an angle that provided enough shelter for both of us. Him because he held it up, and me because I sat between his feet. He was looking at the sky, which was the color of wet metal, and he said, "Gev, small ones not come back." I did not ask which small ones. I knew. The ones we had separated, the ones the chimera had taken south. "No," I said, "I do not think they will." He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "We do bad thing." I did not say anything. There was nothing to say that would have been true and also useful. He said, "You know?" And I said, "Yes, I know." He said, "Boss, no." "Yes." "Hat Man, no." "Yes." "Everyone, no." "Yes." He went through them one by one, each name a step in a chain that he was following to its end, and at the end of the chain was the question he had been building toward, which was, why? He picked up his tin cup and held it close to his face and looked at it as though it were showing him something that I could not see, and then he said the word, just that, why, and it hung in the air between us like a weight on a cable. I told him it was orders. He said, "Bad orders." He said, "Yes, bad orders." He put the cup down. He looked at me. He had brown eyes, Thud, the color of old wood, and they were the only part of his face that looked like they belonged to something fragile. He said, "Thud not do bad orders." He had to, I said. Soldiers do not get to refuse. And if he refused, Commissar Strom would shoot him. I said it plainly and without cushioning, because the truth was exactly that simple, and he deserved it in words he could hold. He thought about this for about a minute. Then he said, "Hatman, shoot Thud." "Yes," I said. He nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he has confirmed something he already knew. Then he said, "Okay." I thought okay meant he would follow orders. I thought the bolt pistol had landed in his mind and rearranged his priorities the way it rearranges everyone's, and that I had solved the problem by describing its consequences. I was wrong. I was wrong about what okay meant, and I was wrong about Thud's nature, and I was wrong about solving the problem, and by the time I understood how wrong I had been about all three of those things, it was too late to correct any of them. It happened on day 29. The morning started the same as every other morning that week. Section brief at 0530. Movement to the target hab block by 0600. Loud hailer announcement. 30-minute wait. Then the clearance, floor by floor, room by room. The same mechanical process that we had repeated every day for 11 days and that had become routine, since anything becomes routine if you do it enough times while carefully not looking at it with the part of your mind that is still capable of judgment. The target that morning was a residential complex in Sector 22, a large structure, maybe 18 floors, housing somewhere in the region of 6,000 people, according to the census data that nobody believed. The count having been taken 9 months before the uprising, and 9 months of conflict changes the arithmetic of everything. The first 12 floors went as expected. People came down. People were counted. People who did not come down were brought down. The column formed and moved south toward the holding area, and the chimeras waited at the intersection for the military-age separations, and Thud carried the ones who could not walk and spoke to them in sounds that were not words, and I followed him and tried not to look at anything too closely. Looking closely was a luxury I had decided I could not afford. But on the 13th floor, something was different, and I knew it was different before we arrived, since Thud knew, and Thud had stopped moving 2 steps below the landing and was standing in the stairwell with his head tilted slightly to the side, working the air, doing what Thud did when what reached him through a closed door reached him a long time before it reached me. "Gev," he said. "Bad here." I told him to keep moving. He kept moving. We came through the stairwell door onto the 13th floor, and the corridor opened into a wide communal space, something that had probably been a shared canteen or meeting hall, and in that space there were 300 of them, mostly old, mostly very young. A few women of middle age who were holding children so tightly that the children had stopped struggling and were just being held. There were no men of military age. They had already been taken or had left on their own or were dead. What remained was the residue. The people who could not fight and could not run and could not do anything except sit in a room and wait for whatever came through the door next. What came through the door next was Commissar Strom. He came up the stairwell behind us with 2 troopers from 3rd Section and a data slate and a face that had stopped pretending to contain anything recognizable as human sentiment. He looked at the room. He looked at the 300 people in it. He looked at his data slate. Then he turned to me and Sergeant Lanhay, who had come up behind him, and he said something that I heard perfectly clearly and that I have replayed in my head every day since, and that I will continue to replay until the day something stops the mechanism responsible for memory. The holding areas were full. The secondary processing facility was at capacity. The relocation column could not accept additional intake. These people, And he said these people in a tone that stripped the phrase of its final word and left only these were to be sealed in this room. The exits were to be barricaded. The Hablock's atmospheric recycling system for floors 12 through 18 was to be shut down. This was a population management decision taken at regimental level and endorsed by the Sector Command Authority, and it had a reference number, and the reference number was printed on his data slate next to a timestamp and an authorization code. He was telling us to lock 300 people in a room and let them suffocate. Nobody spoke. I remember that very clearly. The absolute absence of sound in the corridor while Strome's words settled into the space between us like sediment drifting to the floor of a tank. Sergeant Lanhay was looking at a point on the wall about 2 meters to the left of the commissar's head. The 2 troopers from 3rd Section were looking at the floor. I was looking at Thud. Thud was looking at the room. He was standing in the doorway, nearly filling it, his ripper gun across his back and his hands at his sides. He was looking at the 300 people in the communal space, and they were looking at him and the children who had seen him before on other floors, in other buildings, were not afraid of him. Thud had put his weapon down for them and spoken to them in sounds that meant nothing and meant everything, and one of them, a boy of maybe 6 or 7, was looking up at Thud with plain and uncomplicated trust. Thud turned and looked at Commissar Strome. Strome looked back at him. The Commissar's hand was on his bolt pistol. It was always on his bolt pistol. But the position had changed. It was no longer resting. It was holding. Thud knew before the hand finished moving. A man about to fire on something that frightens him goes off like a flare, and Thud stood closer to Strome than I am standing to this recorder, and he had spent 11 months telling me which man in a room was about to do a thing he was afraid of doing. Nobody should be permitted to say afterward that the poor creature could not have known. He stood in that doorway smelling the shot assemble itself and did not move out of it. Thud said, "No." 1 word. No inflection, no volume. Just the word delivered in a voice that was very quiet for a person capable of producing sounds that could be heard across an open battlefield. He said it the way you would say a fact that did not require emphasis, because it was simply and completely true. Strome said, "That is an order, auxiliary." Thud said, "Bad order." Strome said, "You are refusing a direct order in a combat zone." Thud said nothing. He did not need to. He had said no, and he had said why, and everything after that was procedure. I should have done something. I know that now. I knew it then. I was Thud's handler. I was the person whose job it was to manage him, to translate between his understanding and the world's demands, to find a way through the gap between what he was and what was expected of him. I should have stepped between them. I should have said something to Strome about the Ogryn not understanding the order, about giving me time to explain it, about finding another way. I should have lied. I should have said Thud was confused, or sick, or needed to be taken back to the staging area for recalibration, which is a word that means nothing, but sounds like it means something and might have bought enough time for the moment to pass. I did not do any of those things. I stood in the corridor with my mouth closed and my hands at my sides, and I watched because I was afraid. And fear is a currency that buys silence very efficiently. Every part of that is true, and all of it is a way of not saying the other thing. I did not need to persuade Commissar Strome of anything. I could have spoken to Thud. Thud did what I told him. That is not a claim about my authority. It is a description of 11 months. He sat where I put him. He stood in doorways with his hands open until I said, "Move," and then he moved. When the lights failed, he held my arm until I said the words that meant it was finished. There was no order in that corridor that Thud would have understood as an order, because orders were paper and voices from officers he had no name for. But there was one voice in the world that he had decided at some point on a landing field to treat as the way things are. And it was mine. 2 words, Thud, out, perhaps 3. I do not know whether he would have gone. He had told me the night before that he would not do bad orders, and I had told him what that cost, and he had said, okay, and a man who has said okay to that is not obviously a man who can be called off a doorway by his handler. It is entirely possible that he would have looked at me and stayed exactly where he was, and that the only thing my 2 words would have bought was the knowledge that he had chosen it twice. But he might have gone. That is the whole of it. There was a chance, and it was a real one, because he had never in 11 months failed to do a thing I asked, and Strom would have holstered the pistol and written a supervision note, and the barricade would have gone up 9 minutes earlier, and 300 people would have died exactly as they died, and Thud might have walked out of that building alive. I did not say them. Fear is part of it, and that is true enough. That it happened too fast is a lie. I felt the shape of those 2 words arrive in my mouth, and I felt myself not open it. The third answer is the one I come back to at night. Some part of me did not want him to stop. He was doing the thing all 8 of us knew was right, and not one of us was going to do, and calling him off would have taken it away. And while he stood in that doorway, there existed a version of that corridor in which somebody had refused. He paid for that with everything he had. I paid nothing, and I got to keep the version of the corridor where somebody refused. And I have been carrying it around ever since, like a decoration I awarded myself. Strom drew his bolt pistol. It was a standard-issue commissariat sidearm, which means it was old and heavy and capable of removing a significant portion of a human's skull at close range. He held it in both hands because the weapon was not light and his arms were not steady. He pointed it at Thud. Thud looked at the pistol. He looked at Strom. He looked at me. And in that look there was no accusation, and no anger, and no plea for help. There was only what I had seen in him the night before, which was the expression of a man who had reached a conclusion that was simpler and more solid than anything the world could put against it. Not do bad thing, he said, not hurt small ones. Strom shot him. The bolt round hit Thud in the left side of his head, just above the ear, and the sound it made was the loudest thing I had heard in 4 years of war. Not because of the caliber, because of the silence around it. 300 people watching from the room behind him, and not one of them made a sound. 8 soldiers in the corridor, and not one of them moved. The commissar's hand was shaking so badly that if Thud had been a normal-sized man, he would have missed. But Thud was not a normal-sized man, and at that range, with a target that large, even shaking hands find their mark. Thud fell forward, not backward the way men usually fall when they are hit in the head, but forward into the doorway, and his body blocked it completely, and the last thing he did before he stopped being a person who did things was to reach out with his right hand and set his tin cup on the ground inside the room, on the side where the children were, as though he were giving it to someone and wanted to make sure it did not get lost. Then he was dead, and the cup was standing upright on the ferrocrete floor in a room full of people who were about to die, and I was standing in a corridor next to a commissar whose bolt pistol was still raised and whose face held an expression I will not describe because I do not have the words for what a man looks like when he has done the thing his entire function requires him to do and has discovered that the function is monstrous. Then the room came at the door. They had heard everything. That is the part I did not think about until much later, standing at a gate 2 months afterward, with a stylus in my hand. That Strom had read the order aloud in a corridor with an open doorway in it, and 300 people on the other side had listened to a man explain that they were going to be sealed in and the air was going to be shut off. And then they had watched the only person who objected get shot in the head for objecting. Broken was a thing I had been telling myself about all of them, all the way back to the first hab block, because a broken person is easier to move than a frightened one. They came at the door, screaming, all of them at once, and I understood in about half a second that 8 of us were going to be overrun by unarmed civilians, and that the next minute would be settled by whoever reached the doorway first. Nobody reached it. Thud was in it. 300 kilos of dead Ogryn wedged shoulder to shoulder in a frame built for men, with his back to the corridor and his face to the room. They could not climb him. They could not drag him. 40 people got hands on him and he did not move, because he had not moved for anyone in life either, and the troopers from 3rd Section put their barricade together behind him at their leisure, while the noise on the other side went on and on. It took 11 minutes. I know because I stood there for all of it. I have heard it said that his body saved lives because a rush like that ends with a corridor full of dead civilians. That is a comfortable thing to say about an uncomfortable fact. The Imperium ordered 300 people sealed into a room, and the only thing strong enough to keep that door shut against them was the one creature who had refused the order. The room was sealed. The atmospheric system was shut down. I do not know how long it took. I was not there for the end of it. We were moved to the next building before the process was complete because the schedule did not accommodate delays, and there were 6,000 people left in the complex, and the orders applied to all of them, and the reference number on the data slate did not have an expiration time. Thud's body was left in the doorway. Nobody moved it afterward either. He weighed over 300 kilos and he was wedged into the frame, and moving a dead Ogryn requires equipment that we did not have and that nobody was going to requisition for this purpose. So the barricade was finished around him and he stayed where he was. And if there is a detail in this entire account that I would cut out of myself with a blade if I could, it is that one. That they used him to seal the door he died trying to keep open. Nobody in the section talked about it. Not that day. Not the next day. Not in any of the days that followed. There was no discussion, no argument, no quiet protest delivered in a tone that could be mistaken for a question. There was nothing. Thud died in a doorway on the 13th floor of a hab block in Sector 22. And within the hour we were clearing the 14th floor as though the stairwell below us did not contain the body of a person who had been with us for 11 months and who had saved at least 4 lives in our section alone, and who had refused to participate in something that every man in the corridor knew was wrong. The machine did not pause. The schedule did not accommodate delays. And I, Gevren Protha, Corporal, Preskin 61st, handler of the late Ogryn Auxiliary, designate Thud, walked up those stairs and did what I was told and did not raise my voice above the volume required for operational communication for the remainder of the day. There is one more thing to say about that corridor, and it is not about me. The bolt pistol held 1 round at a time, and Strom would have had to reload between each refusal, and there were 8 of us and 1 of him, and the mathematics of that situation are not complicated even by the standards of an Ogryn. Every man in that corridor could see it. Not one of us moved, and the reason was not that the sums were hard. Thud could not do what the rest of us did. His mind did not contain a filing system. It contained a room with 1 door and 1 window, and the light came in, or it did not, and there was nowhere to put a thing where he could not see it. He could not rationalize. He could not contextualize. He could not perform the small, sophisticated, distinctly human act of knowing that a thing is wrong and doing it anyway, by telling yourself a story about why it is necessary. He saw children in a room that was about to become a coffin, and he said no. And the bolt round was the punctuation at the end of the only honest sentence spoken in that corridor. The section was not the same after that. Nothing broke. Something was removed, and what remained still ran and still did what it was designed to do, with a vibration in it that had not been there before. A vibration means something is carrying a load it was not built for. The question is never whether it fails. Sergeant Lanhay stopped talking to me except to issue orders. I do not mean he was angry with me. I mean he had decided that the category of conversation that exists between orders was no longer something he wanted to participate in, because conversation requires a shared understanding of the world, and we no longer had one. Troval stopped eating for 2 days and then started again without explanation. Luskin, whose leg Thud had saved on day 11 by picking up the front end of a chimera, developed a tremor in his left hand that the medici called fatigue-related, and that I called something else in the privacy of my own thoughts, which was the only privacy remaining. Enoch asked me once, about 3 days after, whether I thought Thud had known what he was doing. I said yes. He said, I mean really known, not just... And then he stopped, and I watched him navigate the rest of the sentence in his head and decide not to finish it, and he walked away and we never discussed it again. And there was Brasa. I have started this spool 4 times and recorded over him 3 times, and the reason is worse than he is. He ruins the shape. Everything I have told you arranges itself into decent men trapped in an indecent machine, and suffering is a kind of credential. Brasa was not suffering. Brasa was doing well. He was a rifleman, 19 years old, from a shift town about 60 kilometers from mine. Before day 29, he was unremarkable and slightly slow at everything. After day 29, he was the first man up the stairwell every morning. He got good at the barricades, genuinely good, faster than the engineering platoon, working out which furniture braced a frame best and teaching it to the others without being asked. He started volunteering for the shutter work, which meant closing the external shutters on a sealed floor from the outside walkway, which meant being the last man to look through the glass. Nobody wanted the shutter work. Brasa asked for it, and he was cheerful. That is the part I kept cutting. He whistled on the stairs. He put on weight while Troval was not eating. He talked at meals about getting a commendation out of the campaign and what he would do with the leave. And he was not being brave, and he was not covering anything, because I watched him closely for 6 weeks, looking for the crack. And there was no crack. The work suited him. He had found, at 19, on a hive world, he could not have located on a chart a year earlier. The one thing in his life he was better at than the men around him, and it made him happy. I do not know what became of him. He was not on the transport at Esivard, and I did not ask. But he existed, and a section in which every man is secretly good is a story, and Brasa is the reason it is not one. The Imperium does not need all of us to be Thud, and it does not need all of us to be men who comply while feeling terrible. It only needs a few of us to be Brasa, and there is a Brasa in every section, and the machine finds him inside a fortnight. Commissar Strom continued to walk the line. He continued to deliver operational directives. He continued to rest his hand on his bolt pistol, but the quality of his presence had changed. Before Thud, Strom had been a fixture, part of the architecture of the regiment, as unremarkable and as necessary as the latrines or the quartermaster's tent. After Thud, Strom was a reminder. Every time he appeared at the section's position, every time his coat moved at the edge of my vision, Every time I heard his voice reading from a data slate, I heard the bolt round and I saw Thud's hand reaching into the room to set down his cup. And I felt the specific weight of 300 kilos of dead Ogryn settling into a doorframe. Strom knew this. He knew that every man in the section saw the same thing when they looked at him, and he carried that knowledge the way Thud had carried his cup, close to his body, always present, never discussed. The clearances continued. Day 30, Day 31, Day 32. The holding areas were full and the secondary facility was full, and the new directive, the atmospheric directive, which is what I learned to call it, because it had a reference number, and things with reference numbers are easier to think about than things with descriptions, was applied building by building across the residential sectors. We sealed rooms, we sealed floors, we sealed entire structures. The engineering platoon disconnected environmental systems according to a schedule that someone had written on a form, and someone else had countersigned, and someone else had entered into a cogitator, and the cogitator had produced an output that said that the projected population reduction in sectors 14 through 28 would be approximately 87% over a 40-day period. And the fact that this output described the deaths of several million human beings did not appear anywhere in its formatting, because the formatting was for numbers, and numbers do not scream. There was a confessor. His name was Ossian, and he came up from the regimental chapel with 2 acolytes and a portable censer, and he blessed the sealed doors from the corridor side. 4 or 5 lines said well, in a good clear voice that carried. Then he moved to the next door and started again. Nobody had written that right for this. It was the standard blessing for a completed structure, the kind you say over a new manufactorum or a repaired wall, and somebody had decided it was close enough. Ossian was not a cruel man. He looked exhausted. I watched him bless 400 doors, and I do not know how many I did not watch. I asked an engineering sergeant what happened to the sealed sectors afterward. He said nothing happened to them, and it took me a while to understand that this was the whole answer. They were not going to be cleared or burned or emptied. They were going to be struck off the zone schematic and the bulkheads at either end welded, and the hive would go on living in what was left of itself. 35 million people in a structure built for 92, with 15 sectors behind them that appeared on no map and were referenced only as sealed volume. The Imperium was not disposing of the dead. It was reclassifying the space they were in. Nobody carried people after that. The task had never been officially assigned to him. He had assigned it to himself. So there was no gap in the procedure. No line in the schedule that said, carry the ones who cannot walk, no box left unchecked. His kindness had existed outside the system, and the system closed over the space like water over a stone. Within 2 days, there was no visible trace that he had been part of the operation. His name was removed from the section's roster. His Ripper gun was collected by the quartermaster and tagged for reissue. His flak plate was too large and too damaged to be reissued and was scrapped. His tin cup was in a room on the 13th floor of a building in Sector 22, whose atmospheric system had been disconnected 31 hours earlier, and I assumed it would stay there forever, because I could not imagine anyone opening those rooms again for any reason. The work continued without him. It would be convenient to say I did it mechanically without feeling, like a servitor executing a function. The truth is that I felt everything. Every room we sealed. Every face through a window before the shutters closed. Every sound from behind a barricade that I will not describe further. I did not stop feeling. I stopped acting on feeling, and that is the whole distance between Thud and me, and I will not be crossing it. 43 days into the campaign, I was reassigned. The reason given was operational efficiency. The section no longer had an Ogryn auxiliary and therefore no longer required a handler, and my skills, patience, attention to detail, the ability to manage a complex asset without losing components, had been identified as transferable to a different role. That was the reason given. The reason was that an asset under my supervision had refused a direct order in front of a commissar, 2 troopers, a sergeant, and 300 civilians, and somebody had to carry that, and it was not going to be the commissar. They did interview me. It took under half an hour. It is the most frightening half hour of my life, and almost nothing happened in it. A junior commissar I had never seen before, sent up from regimental, sat across a folding table with a data slate and asked me questions off a list. When had the auxiliary last been fed? What was his standing sleep pattern? Had he displayed reduced compliance in the preceding 2 weeks, and had I logged it? Had his rations been adjusted after the loss of appetite, and on whose authority? Whether the handler had observed deterioration in the auxiliary's condition, and if so, why no supervisory concern had been raised through the chain. Every question was about maintenance. Not one was about the order, or the room, or the 300 people, or what Thud said in the doorway. I sat with my hands flat on the table, waiting for the question that would end me, and it never came, because it was not on the list. What Thud had objected to was not a category the form contained. He thanked me and closed the slate. Thud's refusal was never going to exist anywhere as a refusal. It would exist as a supervision lapse, indexed under maintenance of abhuman auxiliaries. Nobody said the rest of it to me. Nobody needed to. Commissar Strom had filed the incident report, and I know he filed it. Lieutenant Kanhir was required to countersign it and could not meet my eye for 9 days afterward, and the report would have contained a line assessing the adequacy of auxiliary supervision, and there is only one man in a section whose function is auxiliary supervision. They did not shoot me. Shooting me would have required somebody to argue that I had done something wrong, and arguing that would have meant reopening what Thud had said in that doorway, and nobody wanted that written down twice. So they moved me instead, which is what the Imperium does with a man it cannot punish and cannot leave where he is. I was to report to a facility in the deep industrial sector, south of the holding areas, designation Processing Center 7, where I would serve as a logistics coordinator under the authority of a Captain Mordek Vaughn from the Alvinmark 9th. I asked Sergeant Lani what a logistics coordinator did at a processing center. He said he did not know, which in Sergeant Lani's vocabulary meant he knew and wished he did not, and that I should take my kit. I would not be coming back. He said this in the same tone he used for everything since day 29, which was the tone of a man reading words off a surface that he was not looking at. Then he shook my hand, which he had never done before in the 11 months I had served under him, and the handshake lasted about a second longer than a handshake between a sergeant and a corporal should last. And then he let go and turned away, and I picked up my pack and walked south. Commissar Strom was standing at the vehicle line when I went past. He was reading a data slate. He did not look up, and I did not stop, and that is the entire account of the last time I saw the man who shot Thud. He was not haunted. I had spent 14 days constructing a version of him that was being eaten from the inside, since that version was easier to carry than the alternative, and the alternative was standing at the vehicle line in the rain, working through the morning's dispositions, with his hand resting on his bolt pistol, the way it always rested there. Whatever the shot had cost him, he had finished paying it inside 2 weeks, and he had gone back to being a fixture, and the regiment had gone on around him exactly as before. That is what the machine does to the men who operate it. It does not break them. It repairs them. Processing Center 7 was a converted manufacturing plant about 2 kilometers south of the nearest holding area. It was surrounded by a double perimeter of razor wire, which was not unusual. It was guarded by men from the Alvin Mark 9th, which was also not unusual. What was unusual was the smell. The smell reached me about 500 meters before the perimeter, carried on a wind that was blowing from the south, and it was a smell that I recognized from Priscan, from the reclamation facility, from the days when the furnaces ran hot enough to reduce structural steel to slag, and the ventilation could not keep up with the output. It was the smell of high-temperature reduction. It was the smell of things being turned into something other than what they had been. On Preskin, the things had been engines and structural assemblies. At Processing Center 7, the things were not engines. I reported to Captain Vaughn. He was a short man with a beard that looked like it had been maintained on a schedule and eyes that did not move when he talked, which gave the impression that he was looking at something behind you that was more interesting than your face. He told me that Processing Center 7 was responsible for the final stage of the population management process. The holding areas received intake. The secondary facilities separated military-age individuals for further assessment. Processing Center 7 handled the remainder. He said the word remainder with no inflection at all, as though it were a line item on an inventory sheet rather than a description of human beings. It took me most of a week to work out why the place existed at all, and when I did, it was the only thing on Vressengard that ever made me laugh. And I did not enjoy it. The atmospheric method killed people in their homes. We had spent 11 days before day 29 marching people out of their homes. Every column I had walked south, every family I had counted through a wire gate, had been removed from the one place where the Imperium could later have killed them for the cost of a man turning a valve. By the time somebody upstairs revised the method, there were 30,000 people standing in open pens with no ceiling to seal and no recycling plant to disconnect, and they had been put there by us, correctly, according to the directive in force at the time. Processing Center 7 was the answer to that. It was not part of the plan. It was a converted manufactory burning fuel and manpower to undo an outcome we had produced by following orders that were valid when we followed them. He told me that my job was to manage the intake schedule, to coordinate the transfer of individuals from the holding areas to the center, to ensure that the numbers matched, that the documentation was complete, that the daily processing capacity was not exceeded. He said daily processing capacity. I did not ask what it meant, and he did not explain, and we went on the way. 2 engineers discussed a machine without mentioning what the machine is for. I did the job. Day after day, I managed the intake schedule. I coordinated transfers. I verified numbers. I signed forms. I stood at the gate of Processing Center 7 with a data slate and a stylus, and I counted people into a building that they did not come out of, and I wrote the numbers down and I submitted the numbers to Captain Vaughn at the end of each day. He entered them into a cogitator, and the cogitator produced a report, and the report went up the chain, and somewhere at the top of the chain somebody read it and saw that the numbers were progressing according to the projected schedule and was satisfied, and the word satisfied appeared nowhere in the report. Satisfaction, like screaming, is not a formatting option. On the 5th day, I found Thud's cup. Processing Center 7 was understaffed for the volume it handled, and everyone rotated through whatever task needed doing. That morning, I was conducting inventory of personal effects that had been collected from the cleared sectors, a procedure that existed not for the benefit of the people who had owned the effects, but for the benefit of the administratum, which required an accounting of all material assets within the operational area, including personal property of deceased or displaced persons, since the administratum accounts for everything, and the act of accounting is the act that makes a thing real in the eyes of the Imperium, and a thing that is not accounted for does not exist. The effects were sorted into containers by sector of origin. The container from Sector 22, 13th floor, contained clothing, small tools, a few pieces of jewelry, some children's toys, and a battered tin cup with a dent in the rim. The rooms had been reopened. I had not known this. I had assumed they would stay sealed, that the schedule did not include going back. But the schedule included everything. Cataloging crews went through the cleared buildings after the atmospheric systems had done their work, documented the contents, tagged the effects, and shipped them south for inventory. The machine did not merely kill, it filed what it killed. It accounted for the shoes and the cooking pots, and the toys and the cups with the same procedural thoroughness that it applied to the bodies. And somewhere in the chain of forms and counter-signatures, somebody had opened the room on the 13th floor where Thud had died in the doorway and walked past whatever was left of him and picked up his cup and put it in a crate and labeled the crate and sent it to Processing Center 7, where it arrived on my shift and was assigned to me. The rotation said personal effects, and I was the next name on the list. I picked it up. It weighed almost nothing. It was the lightest thing Thud had ever carried, and the only thing he held as though it mattered more than his weapon. I stood in that room full of catalogued belongings of people who no longer existed, and I understood that he had not put the cup down because he was dying. He put it down because he was giving it to them. It was his most precious thing, and he had carried it every day for as long as I knew him, and in the last second of his life he decided that the children in that room needed it more than he did. The cup went into my coat. I did not log it. It was the first thing I had failed to account for since I arrived at Processing Center 7, and it was the beginning of a different kind of accounting that had nothing to do with the administratum and everything to do with the conversation on a rainy night, when an Ogryn had told me that we were doing a bad thing, and I had told him that it was orders, and he had told me they were bad orders, and I had told him that he was right, and then I had followed them anyway. On the 6th day, I found out what happened to the ones we had separated. It was in the transfer manifests, which crossed my desk. The intake schedule had to reconcile against them. The military-age individuals pulled out of the relocation columns went to the secondary facilities south of the holding areas, and they did not stay there. From the secondary facility, they were moved east to a staging field 40 kilometers outside the hive, assessed for physical fitness, and entered into a founding roster. 2 regiments were being raised out of Hive Katren. The paperwork called them the Katrin first and the Katrin second, and gave their projected strength as 11,000 each, and there was a shipping date and a warp transit allocation and a destination that was listed only as a subsector designation I did not recognize. They were not killing them. They were conscripting them. The Imperium was cutting 57 million people off a hive that could not water them, and taking 22,000 of the fittest off the same rolls and shipping them out to fight, because a man who cannot be watered on Vressengard can be watered somewhere else if he is carrying a last gun. Every separation I had supervised had been a harvest. The families in that street had not been watching their people die. They had been watching them get requisitioned. Whether that is better depends on what those 2 regiments were founded to walk into. The destination was a subsector designation. I have never looked it up. On the 8th day at Processing Center 7, I found the file. I was looking for an intake reconciliation form that Captain Vaughn had asked me to pull from the facility's administrative archive, which was a room on the ground floor containing about 60 storage crates full of data slates and hard copy documents stacked without any ordering system that I could identify. The Alvin Mark IX had been running this facility for 5 months before I arrived, and their record-keeping practices reflected the priorities of men who had other things on their minds. I went through 7 crates before I found the reconciliation form, and in the 8th crate, filed between a logistics manifest and a canteen supply requisition, I found a document stamped with a classification header that I was not cleared to see, and that should not have been in that room, and that somebody had either misfiled through negligence or placed there deliberately, and I have never been able to determine which. The document was a planning order. It was dated 9 months before the uprising, the same date as the census. I understood then that the census had not been a count. It had been a procurement exercise, a baseline for the reduction calculation. They had counted the population of Hive Ketren the way a foreman counts engine components before a teardown. Not to know how many there are, but to know how many to remove. The document was stamped by the Departamento Munitorum, countersigned by the Sector Administratum Authority, and it carried a reference number in the same format as the reference numbers on every directive I had been receiving since day 29. The subject line read Population Adjustment, Hive Ketren Administrative Zone, Vressengard, and beneath it, in the dry and passionless language that the Administratum uses for everything from tithe assessments to death warrants, it described the planned reduction of Hive Ketren's population from its current level of approximately 92 million to a sustainable target of 35 million over a period of 18 months. The reason was on the second page, under a heading stamped by the Adeptus Mechanicus. I am not a man who reads Mechanicus documents, but I had read assessments for a living, and an assessment has a shape, and the shape does not change when the subject gets larger. Somebody had looked at a thing, priced the work of keeping it, priced the work of not keeping it, and written down which number was smaller. I knew that handwriting the moment I saw it. The heading said the water reclamation system was operating at 53% capacity and declining. 53% of that plant waters close to 48 million people. The target was 35. The Administratum had not planned against what the plant could do. It had planned against the floor the survey projected some years out, and set the population to fit the worst year, and dated the program to begin immediately, since a reduction takes 18 months, and a plant does not wait for you. A survey notation said the resources required for repair had been allocated to a forge world in the neighboring subsector. A second notation said the forge world was producing armor for a crusade in the galactic east. Nobody else could have touched it. On Preskin, there were 4 machines on our line that no worker was permitted to open, and a man I knew put a spanner to one during a night shift when the adept was 3 hours late, and he was taken away, and we were told he had been reassigned. A consecrated machine is repaired by the Adeptus Mechanicus, or it is not repaired and the Adeptus Mechanicus was busy. There were 3 options listed on the facing page. The first 2 had been crossed out. The third was the one we were living inside, and it said population adjustment to sustainable parameters, which is the phrase I mentioned earlier, and which means when you strip the language down to what it actually describes, killing 57 million people because fixing a pipe is somebody else's job. They chose option 3. They chose it 9 months before the uprising and 14 months before we landed. The uprising was not the reason for the campaign. The uprising was the result of the campaign. Somebody in the Administratum had begun the preliminary steps, restricting food imports, reducing water allocation to the lower levels, withdrawing civil governance support from the residential sectors, and the population of Hive Ketren had responded in the only way that a population of 92 million people responds when the resources required for survival are systematically reduced. Some of them starved, some of them rioted, Some of them organized, and the organization was called an insurrection, and the insurrection was called a justification, and the justification was printed on a deployment order, and the deployment order was handed to the Preskin 61st and the Alvin Mark 9th, and two other regiments whose names I do not know, and we were shipped across the void and landed on the surface of a world that had already been sentenced before we arrived. Everything I had done, every building I had cleared, every family I had marched to a holding area, every door I had sealed, every number I had written on a data slate at the gate of Processing Center 7 was not a response to a crisis. It was the execution of a plan. The crisis had been manufactured to provide the plan with a vocabulary that sounded like soldiering instead of what it was, and the vocabulary had worked. Soldiers follow orders, and the orders had been phrased in words that soldiers understand, and the words had been close enough to the truth that the distance between them and the actual truth could be covered by not looking too closely, which is the thing that human beings are better at than any other thing in the galaxy. Thud could not do that. Thud could not cover a distance by not looking. Thud looked at everything with the same directness, the same inability to look at a thing, and then look away and pretend he had not seen it, and what he saw on the 13th floor of that building in Sector 22 was not an operational directive with a reference number. It was 300 people who were going to die because fixing a pipe would have cost the Mechanicus resources that somebody with more authority than they had decided were needed elsewhere, and 300 people were not worth the argument it would have taken to get those resources back. And he had said no, and the no had cost him his life, and the life had been the only price available. The machine that killed him did not accept any other currency. There was an annex clipped to the back of the planning order. It was a single page, and most of it was columns I could not interpret, but the left-hand column was a list of regiment names, and one of them was the Preskin 61st. The Alvin Mark 9th was above us. Below us were the Carvesian 104th and the Drossic 37th. The heading over the column said Operational Assets, Population Adjustment Program, and the column beside it said, against every one of the four names, the same two words: Priority Attrition. I did not know what the words meant. I copied them onto the back of my hand with a stylus, since there was no one in that room to see me do it, and I went back to my post and finished the shift, and did not think about anything else for 2 days. I put the document back in the crate. I did not take it. I did not copy it. There was no one to show it to, and nothing that showing it would change. The plan had a reference number and a chain of authorization that went higher than anyone I would ever meet or speak to or stand in the same room with. It was not a secret. It was not a conspiracy. It was a decision made by people with the authority to make it, implemented by people with the obligation to implement it, and documented by people with the duty to document it. Every link in that chain was doing exactly what their function required, and none of them had done anything that could be called wrong by any standard the Imperium recognized, whose standards were the standards that had produced the decision in the first place. I went back to my post. I managed the intake schedule. I coordinated transfers. I counted people through the gate. And I thought about Thud and about his tin cup sitting in my coat pocket where the accounting form should have been, and about the word okay, which I now understood had never meant what I thought it meant. It had not meant okay, I will follow orders. It had meant okay, you have told me the truth. And the truth is that they will kill me for refusing, and I have heard that, and I accept it, and I will refuse anyway. It was the most considered decision I had ever witnessed, made by a mind that could not count past 12, and it had taken him about a minute, and it was more honest than anything I had managed in 26 years of being the kind of person who could count to any number and still arrive at the wrong answer. Captain Vaughn called me into his office on the 11th day. He was sitting behind a desk made from a piece of manufacturing equipment that had been repurposed badly, and his eyes were doing the thing they always did, which was look at something behind you. He had a data slate in front of him with a document on it that I could not read from my side of the desk. He told me to sit. I sat. He told me there had been a development. The campaign was entering its final phase. The current population of the Ketren administrative zone, including holding areas and processing centers, was approximately 41 million. The target was 35 million. The gap was 6 million. He paused after saying 6 million, not for emphasis. For the same reason a man pauses when he has lifted something that is heavier than he expected. Then he explained why 6 million was going to take 60 days when the previous 50 had taken less than 2 months. And the explanation was the worst thing I heard on Vressengard that was not said by Thud. The mid-level residential sectors were finished. The atmospheric method had worked there. Those levels shared a recycling plant, and a man with the correct authorization could shut down 250,000 people from a single control station without leaving his chair. Everyone still alive in the Kitren zone was somewhere that method could not reach. The upper spires behind their own sealed environmental system, the underhive that had never been connected to anything, the holding areas, the processing centers. There were no more control stations to switch off. The last 6 million would have to be done one at a time. That was why the operational tempo needed to increase. I asked him what priority attrition was. I had not planned to. It came out while he was still talking about the 6 million, and the moment it was in the air, I understood that I had just told a captain of the Alvin Mark 9th that I had been reading documents I was not cleared to read. Vaughn did not ask where I had seen the words. He did not ask anything. His eyes went on looking at whatever they always looked at, somewhere behind my head, and he answered the question the way he answered every question, which was completely and without inflection. Priority attrition was a deployment category. Regiments classified under it were assigned to theaters selected not for tactical value but for lethality. It had been applied to the 4 Vressengard regiments retroactively, dated to the day each of them made planetfall. Vaughn had found the annex himself 4 months earlier and had assumed I would find it eventually, since I went through the crates properly and most people did not. I asked whether the point was to stop us talking. He said that was not his understanding. He did not have the reasoning, only the classification, and one sentence he had arrived at in 4 months of turning it over. A regiment is stock, he said, and stock gets graded. I asked why he was telling me instead of having me shot. He said my intake schedule was excellent, and he did not want it disrupted by a change in personnel. Then he told me the shift started in 20 minutes, and looked back down at his figures. I did the rest of it walking back across the yard, and it did not take long. Grading stock was my trade before it was anybody's assessment of me. Nobody was worried about us talking. A line regiment does not go home. There is no discharge, and no man we would ever meet again who could act on anything we said, and the program sat in a crate where a corporal could find it. We were spent. A regiment that has spent 40 days sealing hab blocks will not point the same way twice. Some of those men would now refuse what they did without blinking a year ago, and some of them were brassés. On Prescon, I could have told you the disposition of a component like that in inside a minute. You do not repair it. You do not put it back into stock. You write it off against the job that ruined it, and you book the loss to that job's account. That is what the Gesselal Reach was, not an execution. A line in a return that had stopped balancing, a theater with a shortfall, and a clerk who matched the two and moved on to the next entry. I had done exactly this to engines for 4 years and been proud of it. It had never once occurred to me that the assessment would one day be made about me. A man ought to know what has been put in his hands. I am making this on a Vox recorder requisitioned for range correction drills in a supply bay on Essevard, between the hours when the artillery is quiet. The spools are the property of the Departamento Munitorum. I have signed for a box of them against a training allocation that nobody is going to audit, since the unit those spools were issued to is not expected to file a return. Nobody comes in here. A man doing this in a functioning regiment would last a day. The Preskin 61st is not functioning. Stores are drawn against, but not reconciled, and the duty roster for this bay still carries a corporal who went into a medici tent on the third night and did not come out. The paperwork has stopped leading anywhere, and the men running it have worked that out, one at a time, without discussing it. I have a supply bay and 4 hours a night because the machine has already let go of us. That is not mercy. It is neglect arriving at the same address. Everything on them is a capital offense, several times over. I have named a commissar of the Officio Prefectus and described the round he fired. I have quoted the subject line of a sealed Munitorum planning order and given you the figures off its first page. I have told you the classification applied to 4 regiments of the Astra Militarum and what that classification is for. Any one of those sentences spoken in the wrong yard ends with a man being taken somewhere and not brought back, and I know precisely how briskly that works. Operating it was my job. I am doing it anyway, and the reason is not courage. The reason is on that annex. The Prescan 61st was condemned before I opened my mouth. Not suspected, not at risk, but classified, dated, filed, and countersigned, and dated to a day when I had not yet heard of Vressengard. There is no second sentence available. Take the fear of death away from a coward, and what is left is not a brave man. It is a coward with nothing to hold, and what he does with his mouth afterward is not to his credit. But it is the only thing I have that is mine. The order about the 13th floor sits in a cogitator with a reference number and a timestamp, and it will still be there in 1,000 years, correctly filed, and nothing I do will remove it. One Ogryn stood in a doorway and said no, and the Imperium has recorded that as an auxiliary discipline incident with an adequacy of supervision annotation. I cannot change that record. I can only make a second one. Thud cannot say what happened. I can. It is a poor kind of loyalty. It arrives far too late to have been any use to him, and a man who complied throughout and talked about it afterward has not earned very much. I am doing it regardless because it is the last function I have that nobody assigned me. I walked back to my post. I stood at the gate. The first chimera arrived. I counted the people out of it. 23. 14 women, 6 children, 3 elderly men. I wrote the number on my data slate. I directed them through the gate. They walked past me in a line, and none of them looked at me, and I did not look at any of them. And the chimera turned around and went back for more. Thud's hands were in my head, the hands that could close around a rib cage, and that he had opened, palms outward, to show frightened people he meant no harm. His voice, saying not angry and small ones scared and bad order, and not hurt small ones. The word okay. The cup in my pocket that weighed almost nothing and was the heaviest thing I was carrying. Thud had known instantly what it took me 8 days of filing and 1 misfiled crate to discover. He had known it the way he knew everything, directly, without documents, without translation. The second chimera arrived. 19 people, I counted them. I wrote the number. I directed them through. The cup was in my pocket. Old, he had called it. The oldest thing he owned. The only thing he had loved that was not alive. I stood at the gate and I did my job, and I wondered at what exact point in that process, the process of becoming the kind of person who can count people into a building they will not come out of. The capacity to say the word no had been removed from me with such surgical completeness that I had not even noticed it was gone. The third chimera arrived. I counted, I wrote, I directed. The cup weighed nothing. It weighed everything. On the 14th day, I stopped counting. It was not a decision the way Thud's had been. His refusal was a single clear act, spoken out loud, his body between the order and the people it was aimed at. Mine was the kind of failure that starts as a small mechanical breakdown. I put down the data slate. I did not throw it. I did not break it. I set it on the crate next to the gate, the way you set down a tool at the end of a shift, carefully, since someone else would need to use it. And then I walked away from the gate and sat down against the perimeter wall and watched the fourth chimera arrive and stop and open its ramp, and the people inside it step out into the yard and look around with the expression that all of them wore by this point in the process, which was the expression of people who have stopped asking where they are going, the asking having never produced an answer, and the energy it costs is energy they no longer have. Nobody shot me. That is the detail that hurt most. Nobody drew a weapon. Nobody shouted. Nobody delivered a speech about duty or discipline. A trooper from the Alvin Mark 9th, whose name I never learned, walked over to the crate, picked up the data slate, read the last entry, and resumed counting from where I had left off. The chimera was unloaded. The people were directed through the gate. The numbers were recorded. My absence produced a delay of about 90 seconds, which was how long it took somebody to notice the slate sitting on the crate. And inside 2 minutes, the operation was running at the tempo it had before I put it down. That was the difference between us. Thud had put his body in a doorway, and a body that size cannot be stepped around or replaced by whatever is nearest. What I had put down was a piece of equipment, and someone picked it up. His refusal was a wall. Mine was a pause, and pauses close themselves the way wounds close on healthy skin. Captain Vaughn found me about an hour later. I was still sitting against the perimeter wall. He stood over me with his hands behind his back and his eyes focused on that permanent middle distance, and he said, "Corporal Prather." I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "You appear to have left your post." I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Is there a medical reason?" I said, "No, sir." He nodded the way a man nods when a machine has produced the output he predicted, and I suspect he had written it down before he came out to find me, since Captain Vaughn's reports were never late and never surprised. He told me I was being transferred back to the Preskin 61st effective immediately, that my replacement was already assigned, and that a transport would take me within the hour. He did not mention the priority attrition deployment. He did not need to. We both knew where I was going. It was not punishment. Punishment implies somebody did something wrong, and what I had done was cease to be operationally effective, which is an administrative category with an administrative solution. I arrived back at the regiment that evening. The Prescan 61st was in a forward base in Sector 30, 12 kilometers north of the processing centers, in a part of the hive already cleared and sealed. The buildings were intact, the streets were clean, and there was nobody in any of it except soldiers moving through a city built for millions like insects in an empty skull. Sergeant Lani saw me arrive and said nothing. Luskin raised a hand from across the yard. Trovel looked at me and looked away. Enick was not there. I asked where he was. The sergeant said Sector 26 last week. He said it the way you say a grid reference. We shipped 4 days later. A little over 8,000 men out of the 11,000 that had landed, loaded onto bulk transports with a deployment order, sending us to the Gesol Reach, a name nobody in the regiment had heard, to reinforce a campaign against an enemy the order did not specify, in a region the briefing called active. In the vocabulary I had learned to read, active meant people were dying there in numbers that required replenishment, and we had been identified as the replenishment. Nobody asked questions, nobody protested, nobody said no. Saying no was a thing Thud had done, and Thud was dead, and the lesson was clear, and we had all learned it, and the machine that taught it was the same machine that was now loading us onto transports. I carried the cup, through the loading and the embarkation, through the crossing, which took 3 weeks and was quiet, through the disembarkation, which was loud and smelled of burning fuel and hot metal and fear, into the staging area on a world called Essivard that I had never seen and would probably not leave, where the sky was the color of a bruise and the ground shook from artillery nobody explained. I carried it through every step of a process designed to bring 8,000 men to a place where they would be used up by an Imperium that had already used them for the worst thing it could find, and was now discarding them the way you discard a tool contaminated by the material it was used to cut. On the second day at Essivard, a supply transport arrived from the rear depot with ammunition, ration crates, and a replacement Ogryn. I was the only man in that yard who could read what that meant. Every man on the Preskin 61st was scheduled expenditure, and the Munitorum had still routed us a fresh auxiliary against our returns correctly on time with a docket. A disposal only works if it looks like a deployment, so they sent us bullets we would fire and food we would eat, and one more living creature to be spent alongside us, and the paperwork for all 3 was identical. His name was Druck. He was slightly shorter than Thud and slightly wider, and he had a scar across his forehead that looked like it had been made by something industrial rather than something military. He came off the back of the transport in a crouch, the ceiling clearance not built for him, and he stood up on solid ground and rolled his shoulders and looked around very slowly. And the resemblance to that first day on Preskin was so precise that for a moment I thought the universe was repeating a sentence it had already spoken, the way a lectern servitor sometimes cycles back to a passage it has already read, a gear having slipped in the mechanism. Sergeant Lanhi looked at him, looked at me, did not say he is yours, Pratha. The sergeant had not said that many words to me in sequence since day 29. He just tilted his head in the direction of the Ogryn, and the gesture said everything the words would have. I walked over and stood in front of a person who was not Thud, and who looked at me the way Thud had. The immediate, unconditional assessment of someone who cannot divide his attention between what he feels and what he shows. He said, "Hello." I said hello back. Then he reached out and picked up my pack, which was sitting on the ground next to me, and put it on his shoulder next to his Ripper gun, and started walking toward the barracks, and I stood there watching him go with a cup in my pocket that weighed nothing and meant everything, and that was the only thing I owned that had ever belonged to someone who understood what I had spent every day since day 29, failing to understand. I followed him. He was not Thud, but he would do the same things. That is what Ogryns do. He would carry frightened people. He would put his weapon down in rooms full of children. He would smell the men around him and know which of them was afraid and which was lying, and when the orders had crossed out of soldiering into something else. And when that moment came, he would say no, and someone with a bolt pistol would do what someone with a bolt pistol always does, and the body would fall, and the machine would continue, and the cup would end up in somebody else's pocket, and that man would carry it to the next campaign and the next refusal that changed nothing except the man who witnessed it. Druck was holding a tin cup against his thigh as he walked. Battered, dented, old. I reached into my pocket and took out Thud's. "Gev," said Druck, who had heard Luskin call me that from across the yard, and Ogryns learn names quickly when they decide someone belongs to them. I held it out. He looked at it. He looked at his own. He looked at mine. Then he reached out with his free hand very carefully, the way Thud used to pick up a child, and he took it. He did not ask whose it was. He did not ask where it came from. He turned it once in his hand, ran his thumb along the dent in the rim, and then he held it next to his own and compared them side by side. And something crossed his face that does not exist in the range of expressions human beings produce. It belonged to a species of understanding that does not translate into any language I speak. Then he put both cups on his belt, side by side, and walked into the barracks. I stood outside for a while. The artillery was shaking the ground again. The sky was bruised. Somewhere to the east, the campaign we had been sent to die in was waiting, with the patience of a system that has scheduled our arrival and calculated our expenditure, and written both figures into a document that someone will file, and someone else will audit, and someone else will reference in a report that concludes that the output was within acceptable parameters. Thud had known. He had known on day 29, standing in a doorway on the 13th floor with 300 people behind him and a bolt pistol in front of him. He had known the one thing that none of us could know, since knowing it requires a kind of mind that cannot be taught to look away from what it sees. He had known that the order was wrong, and he had refused, and the refusal had cost him everything, and it had changed nothing, and it was the most important thing that anyone did on Vressengard. I walked into the barracks. Druck had already claimed a corner and was sitting against the wall with his ripper gun across his knees and 2 tin cups on his belt and his brown eyes open and his head tilted slightly to one side, listening to something I could not hear. I sat next to him. He put his arm around me, gently, the way you would shelter something small from weather, and I let him, because there was nobody else left who would have done it. And the arm was warm and the barracks were cold, and an Ogryn's kindness is the only kind I have ever trusted, since it is the only kind that does not know how to be anything other than what it is.